The bread's gone cold on the plate. I know that without opening my eyes. Cold bread, cold salt, sitting right there on his chest, rising and falling with every breath he isn't breathing anymore. Somebody's supposed to eat this. That's the rule. Somebody sits down at the foot of the bed, eats what's been laid on the dead man's chest, and carries what he did wrong so he doesn't have to carry it into the ground with him. Problem is, nobody in Amen Gap would do it. Not for Amos Sutter. Not for a man who'd eaten for other families for 40 years and never once turned down a plate. So it's me. It's got to be me. And the plate. The plate is already warm again. All right. Let's just sit with that a minute before we go any further. Silas Vance is the name the county put on my library card years back, though I don't believe anybody's called me that since I was young enough to be embarrassed by it. Around Amen Gap and most everywhere else in these hills, I've always just been Abe. If you've sat with me at this table before, you know how this goes. Pull the blanket up, get comfortable, let the rest of the world go quiet for a while. And if tonight's the first time you found your way here, well, there's room for one more. Tonight we're talking about Amos Sutter, Sin-Eater of Amen Gap for the better part of 40 years, and the plate that came after him. Now, if you don't know the custom, I'll lay it out plain, because it matters for what comes next. In the old hollows, when somebody died, the family would set out a meal. Bread, salt, sometimes a little cider or ale, depending who you asked. They'd lay it across the chest of the dead, right there in the coffin or on the cooling board. And they'd fetch a stranger, somebody willing, somebody hungry, somebody the family didn't much care to look at again after, to sit down and eat it. The idea was simple. Whatever sins that dead man carried, whatever he never made right before the Lord got hold of him, the eater took it on himself, ate it clean off the body, and the dead went into the ground light, unburdened, free to rest. The eater didn't go free of anything. That was the whole point. Amos Sutter did that job for 40 years. Nobody in Amen Gap asked him to start. He just started. Said somebody had to. And he'd rather it be a man who understood what he was taking on than some stranger passing through who didn't know what he was signing up for. Every family in that holla had at one time or another set a plate on somebody's chest and watched Amos Sutter sit down and eat. Amos passed this last October. Quiet. In his sleep, the doctor said, which is the kindest way a man like that could have gone. And his grandson, Eli Sutter, come back down from Ohio to bury him. Eli hadn't been to Amon Gap in near 15 years. Didn't much care for the holla, if I'm honest. And the holla didn't much care for the Sutter name, on account of what old Amos did for a living. Folks respected him, needed him, didn't want to sit next to him at church, most of them. So when Amos died, and the family went looking for somebody to sit down and eat his sins the way he'd eaten everybody else's, nobody would do it. Nobody'd come near that plate. 40 years is a long time to collect what other people didn't want to carry. And the thinking in Amen Gap, whether it's true or not, was that a man who's eaten that many sins is carrying something in him that you don't want passed down to you second hand. Nobody wanted Amos Sutter's plate in their hands, not even for an afternoon. Eli sat in that funeral home 2 full days waiting on somebody to step up. Nobody did. And here's the thing about the custom, if you don't already know it. A sin-eater has to have his own sins eaten when he goes. Has to. Otherwise he doesn't rest easy. He just sits there, on the other side of things, carrying every sin he ever took on top of his own, forever, with nobody left to take it off him. Eli didn't believe in any of that. Told the funeral director as much. But he also couldn't stand the thought of his grandfather laying in a box with a cold plate of bread on his chest and nobody willing to touch it. So on the third night, alone in that back room, Eli Sutter sat down at the foot of his grandfather's coffin, picked up the old wooden plate that had been in that family longer than anybody could say for certain, and he ate. Bread first, then the salt, right off the wood. He said later it didn't taste like much of anything. Said it was easier than he expected. And that's what should have told him something was wrong. 40 years of sin ought to taste like something. He finished the plate, set it down, and that was that. Except it wasn't. Eli stayed in Amos's old house to close it out, sort the belongings, deal with the land, all the business a family's got to handle after somebody passes. Said he figured a week, maybe 2. First few nights, nothing. Quiet house. Old house. The kind that ticks and settles the way old houses do. And Eli told himself that's all it was. 4th night he came down for water and found the plate sitting on the kitchen table. He hadn't put it there. He'd packed it away that first morning, wrapped it in a dish towel, set it on the top shelf of the pantry where he wouldn't have to look at it. But there it was, middle of the table. Queen. Not a crumb on it. Eli figured he'd forgotten. Figured grief does things to a man's memory. He put it back on the shelf. Next morning, the table again. Same spot. Same angle, like it had been set down careful, not tossed there. Eli said he stood in that kitchen doorway a good long while just looking at it. The way you'd look at a dog that wasn't supposed to be able to open doors on its own. Now I want you to sit with that a minute, because this is where the story starts to lean on you a little. It's not the plate moving that ought to worry you. Plenty of things get moved in a house full of grief and half-packed boxes. It's what Eli said happened after. Said he started noticing things he couldn't account for. Small things at first. He'd feel a weight of shame come over him out of nowhere. Walking through the yard, standing at the sink. Shame that didn't belong to anything he'd ever done. A feeling like he owed somebody an apology he couldn't place. He'd stand there with his hands wet from the dishes and just feel it settle into his chest like a stone dropped into water. Then it got to where he'd catch pieces of memory that weren't his. A woman's face he didn't know, crying over something. A field he'd never stood in, on fire. A conversation, half heard, about money owed that he'd never owed anybody. One night he woke up with a taste of whiskey in his mouth, sharp and old, though he hadn't had a drink in years. Another night, standing at the bathroom mirror, he caught himself mouthing an apology to somebody who wasn't there, in a voice that wasn't quite his own cadence. And he had to sit down on the edge of the tub until it passed. There was a morning, too, when he woke up with his knuckles raw, like he'd been working with his hands all night, splitting wood or hauling stone, though he hadn't left the bed. He turned his hands over in the kitchen light a long while, looking for a reason that made sense, and never did find one that satisfied him. He started keeping his sleeves down after that, even in the heat, like covering it up might keep it from happening again. He told himself it was the grief. Told himself grief makes a man's mind do strange things, borrow feelings from nowhere. And maybe that's even true. I've seen grief do stranger. But the plate kept finding the table. He tried leaving it in the truck. Found it on the table the next morning. He tried giving it to his aunt, who lived 2 hollows over. Told her she could have it or throw it out, he didn't care which. He set it on her porch himself, knocked twice, and drove off before she could answer the door. The way you'd leave something you weren't proud of. She called in that same evening, said it wasn't on her porch where he'd left it. It was back on his kitchen table. And how in the world did he manage that so fast? with her not 2 hours since he'd dropped it off. Eli didn't have an answer for her. Didn't have one for himself either. Now, before I go on, I want to fold something in here quiet-like, because it matters to me, and I don't like to make a fuss out of it. If you're new to this table, and you found something in this story that fits the shape of the nights you're having trouble getting through, go on and follow along, so you don't lose your seat here. That's all I'll say on it. Back to Amos Sutter's plate. By the second week, Eli wasn't sleeping right. Said the house had a weight to it after dark that it didn't have during the day. Not a sound, not a sight. Nothing he could point his flashlight at and say, "There, that's what's wrong." Just a weight, like sitting in a room with somebody who's disappointed in you and hasn't said why yet. He started going through his grandfather's old things, looking for something, an answer, a letter, anything, and he found a ledger. Amos had kept one all those years. Not names. Amos was careful never to write down names, but dates. 40 years of dates, going back further than Eli could account for in his own head, further than his grandfather's whole life, if he was honest with himself about the earliest entries. Some of those dates went back near 90 years. The handwriting changed every so often, too. Not just faded with age, but different hands altogether. Different slants, different ink. Like the same book had been picked up by different people across different lifetimes, and carried on without a single date ever missed. Eli sat with that a long while, because if the ledger was right, Amos Sutter wasn't the first Sutter to eat for Ammon Gap. There'd been others before him. And the plate, the same plate, the wood worn smooth in the same 4 spots where 4 generations of hands had held it steady. The plate had been passed down every time, right along with the job. Every sin-eater eats for the last one when his time comes. That's the custom. That's the whole reason it works. So nobody's left carrying it alone forever. Eli hadn't just eaten his grandfather's sins that night in the funeral home. He'd taken on everybody's. Every soul in that ledger. Every soul that ledger didn't have room to name, going back near a century. All of it still sitting in that house, still looking for somewhere to settle now that Amos wasn't there to hold it anymore. That's what the weight was. Not one dead man's guilt. A whole hollow's worth, handed down plate to plate, generation to generation, waiting on the next set of hands willing to sit down and eat. Eli said once he understood that, the house made a kind of sense it hadn't before. The way certain rooms felt heavier than others. The way the weight seemed to gather most in the kitchen, right around that table, like it had somewhere particular it wanted him to be. He stopped avoiding the kitchen after that, said there wasn't much point. It knew where he'd end up eventually. He started sitting there on purpose some evenings, just to see what it wanted from him. Said it never asked for anything he could name. Just sat there with him, patient as an old dog by the fire, content to wait as long as it needed to. Eli tried to end it. Of course he did. Anybody would. He took the plate out back one evening and set it in the burn barrel with the trash. Doused it good with what was left of the kerosene in the shed, and lit it. Said he stood there in the dark and watched the flame catch the wood and thought, foolishly, that it might really be that simple. Woke up the next morning to find it on the kitchen table, clean, whole, not so much as a scorch mark on the wood, not a whiff of kerosene left in the grain, sitting there like it had never once left that room. He drove it out to the county line and left it on a stranger's porch, one of those little free box setups folks leave out for donations. Figured somebody unconnected to Amon Gap might take it, and that'd be the end of it. It was back on his table by supper. He even tried one night just holding it, sitting across from it at that same kitchen table, staring at that plate like it might explain itself if he waited long enough. Said the weight got heavier the longer he sat there. Said he started to feel real clear that the plate wasn't finished, that it had been full plenty of times before, and every time it found a way to empty itself back out onto the next Sutter who came along, which meant it wasn't going to stop needing somebody, not because of anything Eli did or didn't do, just because that's what it was built for, way back whenever the first plate got carved. And it wasn't going to unlearn that now on account of one tired man wanting some rest. Eli's still in that house, far as I know, still closing out the estate, or telling himself that's what he's doing. The plate's still on the table most mornings, whether he puts it away the night before or not. And here's the part that sits heaviest with me, out of everything Eli told me. He said he stopped trying to get rid of it. Said instead, some nights he just sits at that table and wonders who's going to eat for him when his time comes. Because somebody's going to have to. That's the custom. And a plate like that, a plate that's been passed down clean through 4 generations, that's outlived fire and distance and every attempt to set it down for good. A plate like that doesn't much care whether the next hands are willing. It's just going to wait. same as it's always waited. I don't know what became of that ledger, or whether Eli's kept adding to it the way his grandfather did. I expect he has. I expect a man in his position doesn't have much choice but to keep the custom going one way or another, even if he never says it out loud to anybody but a stranger on the phone. He did tell me one more thing, though, right before we hung up. Said some evenings, sitting at that table, the weight in the room eases up for a spell. Not gone, just quiet. And in those spells, he almost understands why his grandfather never once complained about the job. Said maybe there's a kind of peace in it, carrying what other folks couldn't. He didn't sound sure of that. He didn't sound unsure of it either. Silas Vance is the name on my library card. Abe's the name folks use when they're settling in for the night. Same as you're doing right now. If Amon Gap's plate ever does find its way to an empty chair near you, I expect you'll know it. I expect the bread will be a little too warm for how long it's been sitting there. Go on and get some rest now. The table will still be here tomorrow. It always is.